I am Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series each semester. This semester we're talking about those traditions and institutions that have stood the test of time. Today is no different. Let's introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jennifer D. Thibodeaux is Associate Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She earned her PhD in Medieval European History from the University of Kansas with a focus on church history and gender history. She has published extensively on the subject of medieval clergy and masculinity. Her book, The Manly Priest, Clerical Celibacy, Masculinity and Reform in England and Normandy 1066 to 1300 is forthcoming from the University of Pennsylvania Press in October 2015. Her lecture today is titled, Why Are Catholic Priests Still Celibate? Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Thibodeaux.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really wired, literally, to this podium, so I'm probably going to stay kind of close. My habit is usually to walk around and to speak to people closer, but I'm afraid that there would be a lot to carry. So if you can't hear me, let me know. They can always adjust the mic, all right? So my topic today is why are Catholic priests still celibate? And this seems kind of timely because Pope Francis is coming to the United States this week, which I think is really exciting. I came onto this subject as a student in graduate school many, many years ago, when I started pursuing the areas of church history and gender history. And for a long time, I studied religious women in the Middle Ages, and then eventually I shifted to some bigger questions concerning religious men, and particularly Catholic priests. So, as you probably know, Catholicism is the only Christian denomination currently in the West that prescribes celibacy for its clergy. So to be an ordained priest of the Catholic Church, you must remain in an unmarried state. And literally, celibacy means an unmarried state. We assume that along with being in an unmarried state, you also remain chaste, right? And so when we talk about celibacy as a condition, it is the expectation that one will live in with sexual abstinence for the duration of their life. As I said, the Catholic Church remains an institution that has not changed since the Middle Ages when this law was created. So when we talk about institutions that remain the same or that change, we can look to the Catholic Church as one that, in regards to its clergy, its ordained priests, hasn't changed very much at all. A couple of things. As I go through this talk, I'm going to be using some terms that I just want to clarify. And for most of you, if you know anything about the Middle Ages, you know that there were a lot of monks and nuns in the Middle Ages. Well, a monk is a man who professes to live the holy Christian life inside a monastery. That is a life of contemplation, focused on poverty, chastity, and obedience. This is actually a different occupation from that of a priest. In the Middle Ages, a priest was a minister who served his congregation, much like you might have a pastor or minister or priest today. So the priest is out in the world, the monk has retracted from the world, has gone into the cloister. So these are two important distinctions. Today, one might argue that the professions of monk and priest in the Catholic Church are closer together than they were in the Middle Ages. All right, so let's go someplace unexpected. Let's talk for a moment about the biblical precedent for clerical celibacy. This could be a topic all its own, so I won't delve into the entire history of whether or not the Bible prescribes celibacy for its priests or not. But what I will say is that the canonical New Testament, which means Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that appear today in the New Testament, show images of Jesus and his disciples that seem to affirm an unmarried lifestyle, one that is taken to the preaching of the gospel without the, and this is a terrible expression, without sort of the bothersome duties of being a husband and father, all right? If you go back and you read the New Testament Gospels, you know that the life of the Christian, of the person who spreads the gospel, is one who takes to the road and sort of leaves behind his family. We won't go there with her family. That's for another talk. Okay, so what we know is that in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is presented as unmarried. He is not associated with any woman in terms of having a sexual relationship or an intimate family relationship. The only woman that he's routinely associated with is his mother. We also know that about the early disciples, there is some evidence that Peter might have been married, but there is not a whole lot of evidence for all of the other disciples. Now, the early church later on will assert that all of the disciples were unmarried. That's not necessarily biblical. We know Peter, it is suggested in the Bible that Peter was married, but we don't know about the rest of them. We only know about their presentation. Now, something else about the New Testament, and as it pertains to a history or a justification for the unmarried life, is you may be familiar with Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is an enormously popular letter that Paul wrote to the Christian community at Corinth to maintain contacts or ties with them while he was out on the road. In one very famous passage, 1 Corinthians verse 8, Paul says, and I'm just going to roughly paraphrase this one, to the unmarried and widowed, I say you should remain as I am, which is unmarried. So this becomes a really powerful statement, because later on, when the Church of the Middle Ages, begins justifying clerical celibacy, they recall back to this statement that to live the unmarried life is seen to be a higher calling than to be married. To live in a state that you're not bothered by the duties of being a husband and a father and caring for a family, but to devote yourself solely to God, this is considered to be a very powerful high state. And just one little corollary to that, Paul does say if you can't control yourself, you should marry. So just have to throw that one out there. So when we talk about the early precedent for clerical celibacy, we have, of course, this little bit from the New Testament. We also have something else that you may not think of, which is that we know that early Christianity really built itself on the model of the Jewish priesthood. That very early Christianity had a lot of influence from Judaism at the time. So we know that Jewish priests observed a ritual purity, and it was very common for Jewish priests to abstain from sex for a prescribed period of time before they entered temple service. There's a sort of purity or impurity that it was believed affected the temple and the altar. So we believe that a lot of this influence from Jewish tradition spilled over into some of the early Christian tradition. Christianity adopted a similar attitude of purity versus impurity with regard to the body and the body's fluids, which could contaminate. When we get to early Europe, so Christianity has been around now a few hundred years. We have this emergent Christian church. Christian doctrine is not completely spelled out. Some people believe one thing about Christ, others believe something different, but the Christian church is really in a phase of defining what we believe. What do we as Christians believe about the nature of Jesus? Is he more man? Is he more godly? How is Jesus related to God the Father? Is he the same? Is he lesser? All of these are really pertinent questions that are building during this early period of the church's history. But something else that we have to pay attention to is the realities of social life, which is that in the West, in Western Europe, those places that will become France and England and Spain and even Italy, life is very agrarian. And I know saying this is at a talk at Whitewater, Wisconsin, which is we're surrounded by agricultural fields, right? We know how to run a farm, you need a lot of people, and it helps to have a big family, right? More labor, more children, more sons and daughters. So in early European history, it was common for a priest to have a wife and children. And that's simply because of the nature of life on a farm, needing more hands to produce food. This was a very rural economy. There are very few cities in the West. And so the majority of population was a subsistence population. They worked off the land. They fed themselves from the land. And this is going to have a relevant point later on. So if we want to approach the 4th century, we're still in the very early stages of the Christian church. And how early we are is that Christianity does not become legal as a religion until 325. So even before 325, we have an emergent Christian church that is trying to define what do we believe about Christ? What do we do about our clergy? We should have bishops. We should have people in charge of making sure you all believe the right thing, okay? If we look at these regional efforts, we see Christian communities attempting to deal with topics regarding clerical celibacy. So here are some of the really early ones. The Council of Elvira, which is in southern Spain in 305, mandated that clergy were not to have sex with their wives. Now this is really a bizarre statement that seemingly just comes out of nowhere. So scholars have looked at this and said, you know what? Here's a possible interpretation. Was this intended as a kind of ritual purity when presenting the sacraments, much like the Jewish tradition had mandated for its priesthood? Or was this a permanent condition? Now, part of the confusion stems from the term that is coined, which is continencia, and in English, we could render that into continence. So to be incontinent means to have sex. To be continent means to restrain from having sex. So not quite the meanings that we get today with continence and incontinence, but very different definition at this time. So they use the term continence. Clergy should be continent. Married clergy should be continent. So we kind of look at this law promulgated by this regional council and go, well, did they mean that priests were supposed to never have sex again? Or did they just mean right before you approach the altar as to not to contaminate the purity of the sacrament, abstain from sex with your wife for a week or 2 or 3 or who knows, okay? We're not certain about this, but what we do find is that another church council in 390 said basically the same thing. So now we have a precedent. We're starting a tradition. And whether it meant a ritual purity or whether it meant a permanent condition, the church is going forward with mandating these laws. So these early councils really did no more than assert that married priests should abstain from sexual intercourse with their wives. None of these early councils mandated specifically that clerical celibacy was a permanent condition forever and ever. But if anything, what these early councils told us, just by prohibiting it, they told us that priests were married. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to pass a law to prohibit them from having sex. Okay? In the early church. So let's jump ahead. Oh, I don't know. How about 700 years? You know, when you study medieval history, you're used to jumping about 1,000 years routinely. It's all good. It's all good. So in 1022, the Synod of Pavia comes along, and it takes a pretty specific law, and it passes it. So as to make sure that you all understand exactly what it's saying, it specifically says, priests, deacons, and subdeacons were to be removed from office if they continued living with women. In other words, you don't get to be a priest, a deacon, or a subdeacon if you're going to cohabitate with your wife. You don't get to do that. Their children, the children of these men, were to become serfs of the church. And in the Middle Ages, serfs were semi-indentured peasants, so they were tied to the land. It's a condition of partial enslavement, is what it is. Now, priests, deacons, and subdeacons. Is there anyone here that knows what's the relation between those three groups? Doesn't just say priests. That would be pretty clear. But deacons and subdeacons, do you know?
Priests are major orders, and the deacons and subdeacons are minor orders, kind of like stepping stones to the full priesthood.
Well, actually, yes, you're mostly correct. Deacons and subdeacons are part of the major orders. So priests, deacons, and subdeacons are all three considered major orders. And they're considered major orders because they all approach the altar. They're all clergy that would have some kind of business or officiate some kind of ritual at the altar. So again, we have those issues of purity that seem to be coming into play because this goes beyond what we saw before. This time we have three groups of the highest clergy prohibited from living with women. So let me get to the Council of Bourges. So in 1031, we have another effort, this one far-reaching and very specific, that says that priests, deacons, and subdeacons must separate from their wives, and that they must not take any wives after ordination. So if you were a priest and you were unmarried, once you were ordained a priest, you still couldn't get married after that, just to make sure everyone knew that. Okay, but if you had a wife when you got married, you had to separate from her. You couldn't cohabitate with her. And in pretty much a big whopper of a law, this one also specified that the children born to the clergy after ordination could not enter the priesthood. So if you had children after you became a priest, your children could themselves, your sons, could not enter the priesthood. So it punished the sons of the clergy as much as it punished the clergy. Furthermore, not to neglect your daughters, no man was to marry his daughter to a priest. So these are laws that have these terrible consequences for the children of the priests who for generations had married, had families, and now we're being told to separate from their wives. Their sons were barred from being priests themselves, and additionally, no one could marry their daughter to a priest. Eventually, we come to the so-called Gregorian Reform. So about the High Middle Ages, we're in the 11th century now. This is a big period of church reform. Mid-11th century, there were efforts to firmly separate priests from the women that they lived with. For all purposes, these women were wives. They were married women, they lived with their husbands. But under the Gregorian Church, meaning that this was largely the efforts of Gregory VII. Now, there's a little bit of some quibbling with the term Gregorian. We know that these efforts began before Pope Gregory VII became Pope, but it's simply easier to call them the Gregorian Reform efforts because he really pioneered these changes. These efforts were to separate priests from their wives and to encourage them to live like monks. Now, remember at the beginning how I told you the difference between a monk and a priest? Well, this was a very monastic-driven effort to make priests more like monks. We know that monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Priests did not take those same vows. Those vows are monastic vows. Priests were never obligated to take those vows. But now there's a concerted effort to make priests more like monks by enforcing those standards. This is where we get the really hardline policies of the papacy towards married priests. And I'm just going to run through a few of these. There were 3 synods or councils held in Rome in 1049, 1051, and 1059. The Pope mandated that priests cease from sexual relations with their wives, but also that the laity must not attend the services of a so-called fornicating priest. So basically, a priest and his wife, their intimate relationships are now declared to be fornication and unlawful and immoral. The Pope mandated that the wives and the concubines, which is a terrible term, but it's the most literal translation from the Latin, that wives and concubines of the clergy be made into slaves of the Lateran Palace. And by 1059, the papacy reasserted that the laity must not attend masses of incontinent priests and that such priests are to be excommunicated. So this is a hardline policy because it involves basically all of the parishioners in it. If you think your priest is living with a woman, whether you think he's married or not, don't you go to that mass. You ban that mass. This was a way of trying to effect some kind of change by involving the laity, the congregation, in this policy of clerical celibacy. So the question should be, if this is the history, why? Why do priests have to be celibate? You have your monks, and then you have your priests. Why could this not be two separate occupations of the church? Well, there's actually some major reasons why Catholic priests were ordered to be celibate and without wives. One happens to be the economic basis. So, economically, a parish priest has an income sufficient for one person. And there was some kind of fear that if a priest had a wife and a family, that he would strain the resources of the church and would turn to other occupations to supplement his income. There was also a lot of horribly misogynistic literature which pointed to women as loving their luxurious gowns and their jewels, and that the priest would bankrupt himself trying to provide all of these vanities to his wife. Also, there's a serious concern with church property, meaning the actual church along with the land becoming inheritable property. What happens if you have a son? In the Middle Ages, well, you would pass all of your property to your son. And if that happens to be a church and the land that you live on, well, then that's what you would pass to your son. But there becomes another problem, because throughout this very decentralized period of time, often sons became priests, just like their dads did. They learned how to be a priest, they ran the church, and then when their dad died, they became the priest of the church and they inherited the land and the property. Now, from the perspective of early medieval society, what's wrong with that? All sons followed in the footpaths of their fathers. You know, you could expect a carpenter to train his son to be a carpenter, and so forth. So for a lot of people, this wasn't an issue at all. But the church they wanted to prevent the economic alienation of their property and to prevent these kind of dynasties where, well, my grandfather was a priest and my father was a priest and I'm a priest and my son will be a priest, because they lost control over the selection of the clergy that way. The other one has to concern the doctrinal changes. So many of you are probably familiar with the ritual of the Eucharist. If you're Catholic or Episcopalian, these are really central rituals in those churches in which the congregants approach the altar and they eat the body and drink the blood of Christ. Now, in these churches, those substances, which takes the form of a cracker and some wine, literally turn into the flesh and blood, according to Catholic and Episcopalian doctrines. So it looks like a cracker, it's Jesus' body you're eating. When we get to, and I don't really talk much about this, there are other Christian denominations that see this as merely symbolic, but in the Catholic Church, it is literally believed to become the body and blood of Christ. And the reason that I emphasize that is because that notion of impurity that we were talking about earlier comes back into play. When this ritual, the Eucharist, becomes primary in the Catholic Church, it's sacred. And there's a lot of discomfort with the idea that a priest might, forgive my expression, roll out of bed with his wife and then come into the church, touch the altar with his hands. that there has to be some kind of purification process. And again, we go back to those early Jewish influences upon Christianity. Is there a length of time that a priest could abstain before he approaches the altar? Well, the answer, according to Catholic doctrine, is no. No, you must always maintain the integrity of a pure body to be a priest, because you handle the most sacred object, if you want to call it an object, in Christianity, which is the body and blood that is constantly offered to your parishioners. So this is an incredibly important doctrine, and it becomes even more important the more we go through the Middle Ages. Here's my own contribution to it. So when I was looking at all of this evidence for the doctrinal reasons and the economic reasons, these are very justifiable reasons. I can see why the church made the argument based upon these. But something I also noticed is that as the church tried to make priests more like monks, something interesting in terms of the gender dynamics changed. So monks who willingly took their vows of poverty and chastity and obedience were made out to be warriors of Christ. They were really made out to be manly men. And these are a group of men historically who don't have sex and who've never had sex. They're not around women. They live in single-sex environments, but they're made out to be these great manly warriors. And something interesting happens when you bring priests into the mix. The church wants to masculinize the priesthood by making them more like monks, meaning in order to abstain from sex, that means you have a lot of self-control. And self-control is seen to be incredibly masculine. We expect women not to be able to control themselves in the Middle Ages. And I say that with a lot of cheekiness, okay? But women were viewed to be kind of disorderly and uncontrollable and emotional, but men were strong, controlled, rational. So a priest that was married was seen to be dominated by a woman, whereas a monk lived only for God. And so he was seen to be more masculine. So you introduce the priest into this mix, and he has got to relinquish all ties to women to reach that higher standard, that higher spiritual standard. So what I found by looking at the period, the regions of Normandy and England in the 11th and 12th century, is that there's a lot of rhetoric surrounding the push for clerical celibacy. There's a lot of this rhetoric becoming masculinized, and it's driven by monastic reformers. So no surprise, but the men in charge of the church happened to be also monks. They had spent significant lengths of time in monasteries. They were monk bishops. They were both a bishop that was in a monastic order. One of the most famous was Anselm of Canterbury. Lanfranc of Bec is another one. So these are former monks, now bishops, who are pushing the drive for clerical celibacy among the Norman priesthood. But what I also noticed was that this was not just an automatic change, that in fact, there are a lot of writings written by educated clerics pushing for the ability to be married. And we have evidence that they thought to be married and to have a family was a very manly enterprise, and that it was defended by the Bible, and that it was defended by tradition, and that they simply had always done it. So why would they give up having a wife and a family when it had never been asked of them before? So there's this amazing debate over the subject. Often these same men, and to varying degrees, attacked these monastic reformers and accused them of unmentionable things. But it was a hotly contested issue. Long story short, though, and I hate to ruin that story for you, the clerics lose. And with 1123, with the First Lateran Council, marriage is declared an impediment to holy orders. That means that if you're a priest, you're no longer married. You cannot be a priest and be married. It's impossible. One has to go. So it legally invalidated all of these men's marriages overnight. Now, while this is revolutionary, I'm not going to tell you that it solved the problem. All priests were celibate forever, ever, and they lived happily ever after. Instead, it's an ongoing battle because now it's illegal to be a priest and to be married. And we have evidence that quite a number of Catholic priests continue to live with she's just a housekeeper. She just comes in and cleans my house occasionally. She sometimes stays overnight. No big deal. We have evidence of this, and it continues all throughout the rest of the Middle Ages. So let's jump ahead another 500 years. When we get to the Reformation, we can see that when Luther and his other Protestant colleagues broke from the church, established their own Christian denominations, with it came the ability for a minister or pastor to marry. And there is some evidence that many Catholic priests, especially who lived in the German territories, were happy to quit Catholicism and become a Lutheran. It's all right in the Lutheran Church to be married and have a family. This is not an issue. And so it provided sort of a invitation for many of these Catholic priests that were dissatisfied and were technically living illegally with women. The Council of Trent, though, was held by the Pope in 1545, and it reasserted clerical celibacy as a mandate, but it did something else. It required seminary training for all priests. So I know I've been talking about priests this entire time, and then I didn't mention to you that there's no formal education system in the Middle Ages. So often priests learn how to be a priest if they go to a cathedral school, but there's no seminary training. And seminary training is today still the hallmark of a priestly education. You have to have seminary training before you're ordained. It was hoped, I think, that by seminary training, many of these priests would understand the doctrinal basis for celibacy and would come to it more easily. I'm not certain that that changed anything, but what I can tell you is that there's no studies of clerical celibacy and clerical marriage after the 16th century. So this is a big hole in the scholarship of European history because no one has looked to see, well, are there still problems? Do we have regions of Europe in which Catholic priests are still living with women? We literally have no studies from this time period. For the 15th and 16th century, however, we have two really great studies, one by Marjorie Plummer looking at the German states and one by Helen Parrish looking at England. And they study the impact of the Protestant Reformation on those areas and Catholic priests who convert in order to retain their marriages. So let's just come all the way to the future. Journey through hundreds of years to the modern priesthood. So institutions change, but the Catholic Church's mandate on clerical celibacy has remained even in the face of widespread criticism. So, mid-20th century, Vatican II and Pope John the 23rd. So Pope John the 23rd is said to have been open to the possibility of modifying clerical celibacy in some manner. What we get out of this is that deacons were allowed to be married. That may have been the modification that was offered, was deacons. Not priests, deacons. Pope John died in 1965. He was succeeded by Paul VI. Pope Paul VI wrote a doctrine, and you know the popes are fond of their encyclicals, right? And I know Pope Francis just wrote one that's causing some scandal in some circles. Pope Paul VI wrote Sacerdotalis Celibatus. They like to write in Latin too because they're the only population on the planet that speak and write Latin. Pope Paul said, "Celibacy is a jewel and it retains its value undiminished even in our time." In short, it was a divine call to sacrifice, like the apostles who left their families to follow Christ. So, what about opposition? You know, opposition to clerical celibacy, it comes from many different directions. There are Catholics who believe that priests should be able to be married. There's also a large number of Protestants, particularly in the United States, who don't understand the clerical celibacy of priests. They don't understand why it's necessary, and they ascribe a lot of kinds of behavior and actions to that celibacy. But what I'm going to talk about are some real-world modern problems for clerical celibacy. And one of them is that there is a decline in the number of men who want to enter the priesthood. And whenever the Catholic Church begins talking about clerical celibacy, it's often prompted by a decline in the number of ordinands, of new priests, of young men willing to enter that path, to go through seminary and then be ordained. It is a huge commitment to live a lifetime without marriage and a family, and it's a sacrifice that it seems depends upon the time many men aren't willing to make anymore. Often we have some evidence from priests who have left their orders. They're no longer Catholic priests. And many of them cite clerical celibacy as the reason. There are some numbers of Catholic priests who have left to become Episcopalian ministers or Episcopalian priests. There was a rather famous one several years ago, a Miami priest by the name of, and I'm not kidding, Father Cutier. They called him Cutie sometimes. And he was this relatively young man in his 30s, and he was this really popular Catholic priest. And then one day, some newspaper they snapped photographs of him on a beach fondling a woman. And it turned out that he was having this love affair with this woman, and he'd been in a relationship with her for some time. And so he left the priesthood, and he became an Episcopalian priest. And the church welcomed him because they allow married clergy. So that is a reason that some of them cite for leaving. But let me also offer to you some things you may not know. In 1971, at a synod of the Catholic Church, it was the North American priests who came together to request that marriage be allowed after ordination. So imagine that you have this worldwide synod of Catholic priests from all over the planet. It's the North Americans that say, hey, might we someday be able to marry after ordination? Something else that's raised at the synod. Maybe if we allow married men, it would resolve our shortage of priests. Sometimes there's not enough priests to staff all parishes. Maybe if we allowed marriage, we would have more men willing to commit. This proposition was ultimately rejected, but close to half of those who attended agreed that it was an option. Close to half of the attendees. But here's something that the Catholic Church was able to turn to its benefit. In the 1990s, Anglican or Episcopalian priests, many of them left because it is at that time that the Anglican, also known as the Episcopalian Church, decided to ordain women. So in this kind of odd turn, there were many traditional Episcopalian Anglican priests who didn't believe women could be ordained priests, and they were so offended they left the Episcopal Church. Well, the Catholic Church said, welcome, Anglican and Episcopalian priests, but there's a problem, isn't there? Those men all have wives. So, in kind of an odd turn of events, Anglican priests are allowed to be ordained Catholic priests, and they're able to retain their marriages as well. They had a legitimate godly marriage before they were ordained a Catholic priest, and they can remain so after ordination. This causes a little bit of resentment among a lot of the traditional Catholic priests who were always Catholic priests. I remember I went to a Catholic university, I was around Catholic priests a lot, and we had this big convention once, and there were priests everywhere. And one of my professors was a Catholic priest who was married. He was one of these men who used to be an Episcopalian priest who left the church but happened to be married and had 2 college-age kids. And so I remember being at this convention, and I overheard one of the out-of-town visitors talking to another priest, and this one priest says, "Yeah, I've met a lot of nice people, including our married brother." And so I could kind of hear this kind of, married? So, but they were able to take in a lot of those priests into the Catholic Church. Some bishops and lay groups suggest that the problem of the shortage of priests is connected to a lack of manliness for the priesthood. And I stumbled upon a website a few months ago called The New Mangelization, which is a website devoted to bringing back the manly into the Catholic Church. I'm not certain who runs it, but it's very much about not having female altar girls, no altar girls, only altar boys, raising up the masculine status of the priesthood once again to those who felt that it took kind of a nosedive after Vatican II, remasculinize the priesthood, and to really select priests based upon the manly image they project. Bringing it more currently, the previous Pope, Pope Benedict XVI, before he was Benedict XVI, when we knew him as Cardinal Ratzinger, he suggested that there was more to be lost than to be gained from relaxing clerical celibacy in our own age. But something really important that he said that celibacy was not a dogma. It was an established way of life. And I have to point out to you all that Pope Francis, in February of this year, acknowledged that clerical celibacy is a tradition, not a doctrine, and that it could change. So I think that in terms of where we go from here, we can see that the Catholic Church has opened the door to allowing married priests. It hasn't happened yet. It could happen as long as they suggest that celibacy is not a dogma. Really, anything could happen. Thank you.
Because I can remember so well, this in 1960s, JFK
Yes.
was just having a terrible time trying to prove he is not going to have the Pope come and run this country.
Right.
And now, our politicians, congressmen, just can't get enough.
Well, at least some of them. But you're right to hit upon the sort of anti-Catholic bias that I think the United States has long held. I mean, it's always been held up as a very Protestant nation, but we have a significant number of Catholics, and it's always been an issue of do you hold allegiance to the United States of America or to a foreigner who lives in Rome? So you are right. There has always been sort of this conflict over that. So.
Would you care to comment further about the Eastern Orthodox Church and their view of celibacy?
Yes. So the Eastern Orthodox Church does allow its priests to be married. And this is one of the reasons that in the Middle Ages, the church is split into two. So right about 1059, there was a schism between the Western Roman Church and I'm just going to call it Greek Orthodox, but you could also just call it Eastern Orthodox, which was based in Constantinople. And there were many issues between the two churches. The Pope had proclaimed himself the highest figure in all of Christendom, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was considered to be the head of his church, didn't like that. They excommunicated each other, and that excommunication technically lasted until 1965, when I guess they decided that they would be friends again. So, but there's always been divisions between the two churches, and one of those divisions has been that the Orthodox Church does allow its priests to be married. So,
I would be interested in your opinion as to how the quest for manliness goes along with the silks and the gold brocade and all of that good stuff that sort of was downplayed a bit after Vatican II, but it's sure real popular currently.
Right, so you're talking about the more traditional rituals, pre-Vatican II, right? The incense and the Mass in Latin, no?
No, yeah.
The vestments, the clothes?
Oh yeah, I mean, we want manly on one side and lace and brocade. How's that? They're wearing dresses.
Okay, I don't even, okay. Well, here's what I would tell you. That priest I mentioned who had gotten caught with a woman in Miami, he had been noted for saying, he quoted by a newspaper before that, like a year before that, as saying, "I'm still a man, there are trousers under this cassock." So a little bit of vulnerability when it comes to a man wearing a dress. So there's a little bit of, I still have trousers underneath this cassock. So what about all of the vestments? You know, I guess it depends upon the time period, because we might look at that as something that's very feminine, but the medieval church would have looked at something like that as possibly more powerful, hence more manly, all right? The presentation of power. I mean, if you've ever been to the Vatican, to actual St. Peter's Basilica, it is very ornate. It is got gold inscribed into the dome. And when you walk in, I mean, I've walked into the St. Peter's Basilica and just said, yeah, I get it. This is masculinity. This is a manly statement of power. This isn't a weak little church. This is incredible. So I think the pomp and circumstance creates the vision of power, which I know in our own time we're very particular about what constitutes a man and not. Yes.
I like the idea of the more liberal, you know, the who am I to judge and that type of thing. I believe the Pope's like 77 years old, and I'm thinking about the hierarchy from the Pope to the cardinals to the bishops, archbishops, bishops,
Right.
down to, he is never going to live, or for sure am I going to live long enough to see this come to fruition. But I do wonder I need for you to tell me if this is true or not. I understand already he has appointed 38 cardinals who are more liberal in their point of view. So he is moving pretty fast.
Well, yeah, and I actually wasn't aware that he'd appointed that many. So I couldn't verify that or comment on that. But I think, you know, honestly, in my opinion, strictly my opinion, and it has nothing to do with historical scholarship, but I think that Pope Francis is simply carrying out the mission of the Catholic Church as it was intended. In the Middle Ages, the Church was really responsible for the educational system, the hospitals, all of the social services came from the Church. The secular authorities didn't do that. It was the Church's mission to care for the poor and the sick and to preach the mission of peace. So I don't, you know, some call him liberal, but I see just rather him carrying out a consistency that I find in the Middle Ages. So, I mean, I don't know how much liberal people might expect him to get, because caring for the poor doesn't seem to me to be a liberal. It seems like a human idea, a humanitarian idea, rather than a liberal or conservative or anything like that. So.
But this appointment of cardinals.
Well, if he did do that, then yeah, it sounds like, and I don't know what you mean by liberal. You know, Ratzinger was pretty arch-conservative, so I'm not certain. I mean, anything to the left of Ratzinger would be considered liberal. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe he is preparing. So.